The Deadliest Empress pointed her sword at me, then said, "Kiss me or face obliteration." The grand hall was quiet, but an unspoken tension filled the air. Shadows stretched across the stone floor, dancing as the flickering torchlight touched every corner. The protagonists stood at the entrance, heart pounding in their chest. They had been summoned to meet the Empress, the most feared ruler in the galaxy. No one knew how she had come to power, but everyone knew the terror she wielded. Her name was enough to make even the bravest warriors tremble in fear. The air was thick with the scent of incense, masking the cold chill that seemed to linger in every corner. A throne of obsidian sat at the far end of the room, dark and imposing like the woman who commanded it. The Empress herself was nowhere to be seen, but the whispers of her presence were deafening. It was said she had eyes everywhere, and to defy her was to sign your death sentence. Yet here they were, summoned by her with no idea why. A voice, sharp and commanding, suddenly cut through the silence. "Come forward." The protagonist took a step into the room, the sound of their footsteps echoing loudly in the vast hall. The moment they crossed the threshold, the air grew heavier. Every instinct screamed at them to turn back, to flee, but they couldn't. The doors had shut behind them. They were trapped. The figure on the throne remained hidden in shadows, her presence only felt, not seen. Then, with a swift movement, the Empress emerged from the darkness. Her eyes glowed like two burning coals, and her expression was unreadable. She was taller than expected, her silhouette sharp and regal. Her long black hair cascaded down her back like a waterfall of ink, and the dark armor she wore seemed to absorb the light around her. She walked towards the protagonist with a grace that was almost unnatural, as if she moved through the very air itself. Each step was calculated, deliberate, and yet it seemed as if the room itself bent to her will. "You stand before me, a mere mortal, without understanding the danger you are in," she spoke, her voice soft yet carrying an undeniable authority. "Do you know why you are here?" The protagonists swallowed hard, shaking their head. They had no answers, only questions. Why had she called them here? What did she want, no? The Empress smirked, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "Then perhaps I shall show you." With a sudden motion, she drew a sword from her side. The blade was long and gleamed in the torchlight, but it wasn't the sword that caught the protagonist's attention. It was the way she held it, firmly, as if it were an extension of her own body. The Empress stepped closer, the blade now aimed directly at the protagonist's throat. "You have two choices," she said, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "Kiss me or face obliteration." The words hit like a thunderclap. For a moment, the protagonist stood frozen, unable to process what had just been said. Kiss her? Why? And what did she mean by obliteration? Was it a threat? Or something far worse? The sword remained steady, its edge glinting dangerously in the low light. The Empress's eyes never left the protagonist, her gaze unwavering, filled with a deadly calm. "No one has ever dared refuse me," she continued, her voice growing colder, "and yet here you stand with your fate in your hands." The protagonist's mind raced. This was a nightmare, wasn't it? No one could survive defying the Empress. The legends were true. She had brought entire armies to their knees with a single swing of her sword, and now here they were in the same position with no way out. The protagonist's breath hitched. The Empress wasn't joking. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. This wasn't just a power play or a test. This was a deadly decision, one that would change everything. "Choose now," the Empress demanded, her voice laced with impatience. "Your life is forfeit either way, but I will grant you this one final choice." The protagonist's heart pounded in their chest. This wasn't a game. The sword was real. The danger was real. And the Empress's power, it was beyond anything they could ever understand. With every fiber of their being screaming to escape, to run, to hide, the protagonist remained rooted in place. They had no choice but to face the Empress. But what would they choose? Kiss her or face obliteration? Time seemed to stretch on forever as they stood there, frozen under the cold gaze of the Empress, her sword still pressed against their throat. The world outside the hall could have ceased to exist for all they cared. All that mattered now was the decision that would shape their fate, and in that moment the Empress smiled, as if she already knew the answer. The sword's cold edge pressed against the protagonist's skin, sending a shiver down their spine. The Empress's eyes, burning with an unnatural fire, never wavered. Time seemed to slow as the tension in the room thickened. The air was heavy with the scent of metal and incense, the walls closing in like a trap. The protagonist could feel their heart racing. each beat louder than the last. Why do you hesitate? The Empress's voice broke the silence, sharp and cutting. Are you not a warrior? Do you not know the cost of your hesitation? The words struck deep, hitting a nerve. The protagonist, who had lived through battles, who had seen countless lives lost, was now facing the one enemy they could not fight. Not with weapons, not with strength, not with anything they had ever known. I don't understand, the protagonist stammered, their voice barely audible, but the Empress heard it. Her lips curved into a smirk, a dangerous glint in her eyes. You don't understand because you do not know the truth behind my power, she said, taking a slow step back, the sword still hovering dangerously close. You see, this sword is not just a weapon. It is a part of me, and I am a part of it. It is bound to my very soul. The protagonist blinked, confusion clouding their mind. What did she mean? Was the sword enchanted? Or was there something deeper to it? I was not always the Empress you see before you, the Empress continued, her voice softer now, though no less chilling. Long ago, I was just a child, cast aside by those who should have cared for me. I was weak, helpless, and alone. The protagonist's gaze shifted, sensing the sudden vulnerability in her voice. Could it be true? Had she once been like them? Had she once been powerless, just a person like anyone else? But then something changed, the Empress continued, her voice hardening once more. A power greater than any in this universe found me. It offered me a choice that would grant me strength beyond measure, power that no one could ever take from me. The Empress's eyes seemed to darken as she spoke, as if recalling something she had buried deep within her. The room grew colder, and the protagonist instinctively took a step back. They could feel the weight of her words. This was more than just a story. It was a warning. The price of this power was steep, the Empress whispered, her voice dropping to a cold, almost eerie tone. I gave up everything, my humanity, my soul, and in exchange I became what I am now, the sword I wield. It is the key to my power, but it also holds the curse of my past, a curse that binds me, controls me. The protagonist's mind raced. The sword, her power, her soul, it was all connected. But what was this curse she spoke of, and why was she telling them this now? The Empress's gaze grew distant, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. She looked at the protagonist as if seeing them for the first time, her cold exterior momentarily cracking. But then just as quickly her expression hardened again, and the deadly calm returned. I did not choose this path willingly, she said, her voice unwavering now, as if the vulnerability had never been there. I was forced into it, just as you are forced into this choice. But unlike you, I did not hesitate. I took the power offered to me, and I became the ruler of this galaxy. The protagonist stood in silence, overwhelmed by the gravity of her words. The Empress was not just a tyrant. She was a victim, cursed by the very power that had made her into the monster she was. And now she had brought the protagonist into her web, a web spun from darkness and regret. The Empress's eyes narrowed as she looked down at them, her sword still drawn. Now you understand why I am the way I am, why I do what I do. Power is not a gift, it is a curse. And in order to survive in this world, you must learn to wield it, or be destroyed by it. The protagonist swallowed hard, trying to process everything they had just heard. They had come here thinking they would face a ruler, a tyrant. But now they saw something different. The Empress was not just the monster of legend. She was a person who had sacrificed everything for the very power that now held her captive. But what does that have to do with me? The protagonist finally asked, their voice steady despite the storm raging in their mind. Why am I here? The Empress's lips curled into a smile, but it was not a kind smile. It was a smile filled with dark amusement, the smile of someone who knew far more than they were willing to reveal. You are here, she said softly, because you are the key to my freedom. The words hung in the air like a bomb ready to explode. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat, and they could feel their breath catching in their throat. Freedom? What kind of freedom? And why would they be the key? Before they could ask, the Empress turned away, sheathing her sword with a swift motion. You have much to learn, she said, her back turned to them now. But for now we will begin with the first lesson. The Empress's words echoed in the protagonist's mind, drowning out the sounds of the cold stone hall. They had come here expecting a simple confrontation, a test of their courage or wit. What they hadn't expected was a story of despair, power, and a curse that bound the Empress to a fate far darker than they could have imagined. But now the Empress had made it clear. They were not just here to face her wrath, they were here to play a part in her redemption. The weight of her words pressed heavily on the protagonist's chest. "You are the key to my freedom." They couldn't understand it fully. Why would they, a mere mortal, be the one to unlock her chains? What could they possibly offer someone with such unimaginable power? The choice that had been thrust upon them felt too heavy to bear, and yet there was no escaping it. The room seemed to grow colder as the Empress turned her back, her presence still looming over the protagonist. Her posture was stiff, but there was an undercurrent of tension in her movements, something that hadn't been there before. For the first time, the protagonist saw a glimpse of the woman behind the mask of the ruthless ruler. She wasn't just a cold, unfeeling monster. She was someone who had suffered, who had been broken by her own choices, and now she was asking them to decide her fate. The protagonist hesitated, their mind racing. The sword, the power, the curse, it all felt like too much to comprehend. How could they possibly make a choice that would affect so many lives? The weight of the decision was unbearable. And yet there was something else gnawing at them, something deeper. Could they really walk away? Could they turn their back on the Empress and escape the consequences of defying her? The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. The Empress didn't speak again, and the protagonist was left to grapple with the gravity of their situation. The choice before them wasn't just about survival, it was about something much more complicated. Was it possible to save her? Could they find a way to release her from the power that had consumed her? "What is it that you want from me?" the protagonist finally asked, their voice steady despite the turmoil inside. The Empress didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned slowly to face them, her eyes colder than ever before. The hint of vulnerability that had briefly surfaced was gone, replaced by the unyielding force of her royal demeanor. She was the ruler again, the Empress who had brought entire kingdoms to their knees without so much as a flicker of hesitation. "You are here because you have something I need," she said, her voice as cold as ice. "Something that you may not even know you possess." The protagonist's eyes narrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" The Empress stepped closer, her movements graceful but deliberate. "You think you are in control, that you have the power to choose. But in reality, you are just as trapped as I am. The moment you stepped into this room, your fate was sealed. And now the choice is yours. Help me break free from the curse that binds me, or face the consequences of refusing." The words stung, but the protagonist held their ground. They had faced danger before, had made hard choices in the heat of battle, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival. This was about something much deeper, something they hadn't fully understood until now. They looked at the Empress, truly looked at her, and saw the rawness in her eyes, the same rawness that matched the desperation they felt in their chest. She wasn't just asking for their help. She was pleading for it, even if she wouldn't admit it. The protagonist took a deep breath, trying to steady their nerves. "And if I refuse?" they asked quietly, the words tasting like acid in their mouth. The Empress's gaze flickered for a moment, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips. It was a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that held a bitter, knowing edge. "You will not leave this room alive," she said, her voice low and menacing. "I will make sure of that." The room seemed to darken at her words, the shadows pressing in closer as if the very walls themselves were alive, watching, waiting. The air was thick with the promise of death, and the protagonist could feel the cold steel of the sword's tip pressing harder against their throat. The choice had been made. There was no escaping it now. The only question that remained was what would happen after the decision was made. Would they choose to kiss her and face whatever consequences that held? Or would they refuse, knowing it would lead to their death? The protagonist's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at them to fight, to push back against the Empress's threat. But they knew deep down that resistance would be futile. They had no way of defeating her. No weapons, no allies. It was just them alone with the Empress, and the sword, and the choice. I don't know if I can do this," the protagonist whispered, the words slipping out before they could stop them. "I don't know if I can help you." The Empress stepped back, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the beating of their own hearts, loud and frantic in the silence. Finally, the Empress spoke again, her voice softer now, almost regretful. "You don't have to help me," she said, her tone distant. "But if you do not, you will never truly be free." The words hung in the air, a chilling promise of what lay ahead. The protagonist was trapped, caught between the promise of power and the looming threat of death, and the decision that would determine their future, and the Empress's, was still theirs to make. The Empress's words hung in the air like a dark cloud, pressing down on the protagonist with a suffocating weight. The choice had been given, and yet they stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The sword still hovered just inches from their throat, its gleaming edge promising death with a single, swift motion, and yet the threat of obliteration was not the only force pressing upon them. There was something far more dangerous, something far more powerful, hidden beneath the Empress's icy exterior. For the first time, the protagonist saw a flicker of uncertainty in the Empress's eyes. She was a ruler, a conqueror, a being who had brought entire civilizations to their knees without mercy. And yet here she stood, offering something she had never given anyone before, a choice. But it wasn't just any choice. It was a choice that would define both of their fates. A kiss, or obliteration. The silence between them stretched on, growing heavier with each passing second. The protagonist could feel the tension in the room, the way the air seemed to crackle with anticipation. The Empress's sword gleamed in the flickering torchlight, its sharp edge glinting like a predator waiting to strike. The choice seemed so simple, so easy. Kiss her and live. Refuse and die. But the more the protagonist thought about it, the less certain they became. This was no mere threat. The Empress wasn't just a woman of power. She was a woman with a curse. A curse that had twisted her, that had shaped her into the cold, ruthless ruler standing before them. And yet, despite everything, there was a part of the protagonist that could not ignore the vulnerability they had seen earlier. Could this truly be a simple matter of life and death? Or was there something more to this than just survival? "Why do you hesitate?" The Empress's voice cut through the silence, her tone cold. But there was something softer beneath it, something more human. "Do you truly believe that defying me will bring you freedom?" The protagonist looked into her eyes, searching for the woman behind the mask of power. They saw the depth of her loneliness, the weight of the choices she had made. She had once been like them, perhaps, trapped in a world that offered no easy answers, no easy paths. And yet she had chosen power, chosen to sacrifice everything, even her soul, for the strength to rule. But what if there was another way? What if they could both find a path to freedom, without the violence, without the bloodshed? The protagonist took a step forward, their heart pounding in their chest. They had no weapon, no armor, nothing but their will and their words. But that was all they had. That, and the choice. "I don't want to destroy you," the protagonist said, their voice steady despite the chaos inside. "I don't want to be the one to choose your death." The Empress's eyes narrowed, but there was no malice in her gaze, only curiosity. "And yet you are the one who must make that choice. You are the one who holds my fate in your hands." The sword still hovered dangerously close, but the Empress made no move to strike. She was giving them time. Time to think. Time to decide. The protagonist swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment press down on them like an unrelenting tide. The kiss, what would it mean? Would it truly set them both free? Or would it bind them together in a way they could never escape? The Empress was no fool. She had known the power of a kiss for centuries. She had seen the way men and women had fallen at her feet, driven by desire, by fear, by the need to survive. But this was different. This wasn't about power. It wasn't about submission. It was about something else, something deeper. The protagonist took another step forward, their breath coming in shallow gasps. They could feel the weight of her gaze upon them, the way she seemed to study every movement, every thought. Her eyes were cold, but there was something else there, something almost pleading. The kiss was more than just a simple act. It was a bond, a connection, a promise. And yet, the protagonist still hesitated. The Empress had offered them freedom, but at what cost? To kiss her, to give in to her will, was to accept the darkness within her. To accept the curse that had twisted her, had made her the ruler she was. Could they truly live with that? But as they looked at her, really looked at her, they saw the woman beneath the power. The woman who had been broken by her choices, by the very curse that had given her strength. She wasn't just a monster. She was a person a person who had made terrible choices in a world that had offered no other way. "I can't," the protagonist began, their voice barely a whisper, but the words faltered as they met the Empress's gaze. The silence stretched on, unbearable. The sword remained poised, the threat of death hanging in the air. And yet the Empress did not move. She waited patiently as though she already knew the answer. "Do not make the mistake of thinking you have no choice," the Empress said softly, her voice almost tender. "The choice is yours and yours alone. But know this. If you refuse me, if you choose to walk away, there will be no second chances. No mercy, no escape." The words cut through the protagonist like a knife. The choice was still there, still as sharp as ever. Kiss her and live, refuse and die. It was that simple. And yet the consequences of each path were anything but simple. In that moment, the protagonist understood. The kiss was not just an act of submission. It was a choice that would change everything, a choice that would bind them together for better or worse. It was not a question of survival. It was a question of sacrifice, of what they were willing to give up and what they were willing to become. The sword's tip pressed closer and the room seemed to close in around them. The time for hesitation was over. The time for choice had come. The tension in the air was palpable, the room heavy with the consequences of the decision that hung between them. The protagonist's pulse raced, their heart pounding in their chest as they looked into the eyes of the Empress. The sword was still poised, the sharp tip a constant reminder of the choice before them. Kiss her or face obliteration. The power in her gaze was undeniable, a force that held them in place not just with fear, but with something else, something deeper, something magnetic. The protagonist had never been one to shy away from danger, but this felt different. This wasn't a battle of physical strength or strategy. It was a battle of wills, of souls. And the Empress, with her cold, calculating demeanor, was the one who held the power, the one who controlled the outcome. But there was a question lingering in the back of the protagonist's mind. What if her power was not what it seemed? What if there was something more to this choice than the sword, than the kiss, than the inevitable death she promised? The Empress stood before them, silent, waiting. Her eyes were unreadable, her lips set in a firm line. But there was something beneath the surface, something that made the protagonist pause, something that made them wonder if the power she wielded was truly as absolute as she claimed. "I'm not afraid of you," the protagonist finally said, their voice steady, though the words were more of a challenge than a statement of fact. "But I am afraid of what this will mean for both of us." The Empress didn't flinch. Instead, she took a slow step closer, the gleaming sword still in her hand, but her focus now entirely on the protagonist. "You fear what you don't understand," she said, her voice soft, almost gentle. "You fear the cost of choosing, but it is the cost of refusing that you should truly fear." The words cut deep, and the protagonist felt the weight of them in the pit of their stomach. They had heard of the Empress's cruelty, her cold, unyielding power. But this was something different. This wasn't just about dominance. This was about a shared fate, a destiny that had been forced upon them both, and now it was their turn to decide how that fate would unfold. For a moment, everything was still. The room felt frozen in time, the weight of the decision hanging over them like an impending storm. The protagonist's eyes flicked to the sword, then to the Empress. She was more than just a ruler, more than just a conqueror. She was a prisoner of her own power, trapped by the very force that had made her untouchable, that had shaped her into the deadly figure before them. "You are not the only one who is trapped," the Empress murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "You may think you are free, but you are not. None of us are. Not really." The words struck the protagonist like a bolt of lightning, a realization crashing through them with the force of a revelation. The Empress had never truly been free. She had traded her freedom for power, sacrificed everything she had been in exchange for control over the galaxy. But in doing so, she had become a prisoner of her own making. The protagonist's mind raced as they pieced together the truth of what had been said. The Empress had always been bound to her sword, to the curse that had given her power and condemned her to a life of isolation and regret. She wasn't just a tyrant. She was a woman who had lost everything, a woman who had made a deal with forces beyond her understanding, a woman who had been swallowed by the very thing that had once promised to save her. The protagonist looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the cracks beneath the surface, the cracks that spoke of loneliness, of guilt, of regret. For the first time they saw the woman behind the throne, the person who had once been a victim just like them. The Empress watched them, waiting for some sign, some decision. Her sword was still raised, her presence imposing, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, something that had not been there before. The protagonist took a deep breath, their thoughts swirling. They could feel the weight of the moment, the weight of the choice. They could still refuse. They could still walk away, face the consequences of defying the Empress and risk their life. Or they could kiss her, embrace the power that came with it and become a part of the curse that had bound her for so long. But as they stood there, faced with the impossible, something inside them shifted. The Empress was not their enemy. She was a mirror of their own fears, their own desires, their own struggles. They were both trapped, both bound by forces beyond their control, both trying to navigate a world that had offered them no easy answers. The protagonist stepped forward, their resolve hardening. They had made their decision. The sword was still there, still threatening, but it no longer mattered. The choice was no longer about life or death. It was about breaking free from the chains that had held them both captive. Without hesitation, they reached up and pulled the Empress into a kiss. The moment their lips met, a surge of energy shot through the room, through the very air itself. The Empress's power, the curse that had bound her for so long, seemed to tremble and shift, as if something deep within her had been unlocked. The sword fell to the ground with a clatter, its threat vanishing in an instant. The air around them hummed with an ancient power, and for a moment everything was silent. Then the Empress pulled away, her breath ragged, her eyes wide with shock. "You," she whispered, staring at the protagonist as if seeing them for the first time. The protagonist looked at her, their heart racing. The curse, the power, it was still there, but something had changed. Something had been broken, undone. They could feel it. And they knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same again. The Empress's expression softened, the hardness in her gaze slowly melting away. "I never thought I would be free," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The protagonist nodded, understanding more in that moment than they ever had before. They had both been prisoners, both trapped by their choices. But now, together, they could choose a different path, a path of freedom, of redemption, of something neither of them had ever believed possible.